Hello, I'm Alison Cousins. I'm a volunteer at the Wandle Industrial Museum in Mitcham. This talk, The Wandle in Art and Literature, covers a selection of art and literary works depicting the river and what it has meant to those who enjoyed it or worked by it over the years. It's based on the Wandle Portrayed Exhibition, which opened in the Wandle Industrial Museum in 2018. And that in itself was inspired by early research by Judy Goodman of the Merton Historical Society, to whom many grateful thanks. Contributions are from both local people and also some well-known names. Some entries possibly challenge the definition of literature as such, but are still important personal reflections. However, for space purposes, quote, "Sweet little witch of the Wandle, come to my bosom and fondle," unquote, penned by Charles Mackay in 1840, and Thomas Smith's Memories of Merton, written in 1868, may unfortunately have to wait for another day. I've tried to show a wide interpretation and put it into chronological order. The choice of entries is very much my own. Photographs are not included, although many are very artistic and obviously a rich source of the vistas of the river. There inevitably have to be a few intentional omissions. For example, Charlie Reed, whose vibrant depictions of the Wandle scenes are for sale locally. And at the museum, we also have some samples of work done by the Croydon-based Turf project, an example of how people in challenging circumstances can find art so rewarding. Also, as Honeywood Museum currently has an online exhibition with many of the works of William Tatton Winter, I have excluded him, despite his prolific output of Wandle views. Some authors who lived in the area may have taken inspiration from the river, but there's no evidence. George Eliot, for example, lived in Southfields for a brief period, and it's been suggested that one of the Wandle mills could have given her the idea for Mill on the Floss. Also, Mervyn Peake lived for a time in Wallington, and who knows what locations may have provided material for his unique mind. Anyway, we'll start with William Camden. His Britannia was originally written in Latin, and that was the custom of the day. And it was a result of his travels around the country to record history and some literary works. He created the word vandalis to describe the river, and this caused subsequent scholars to believe that he had reconstructed the original Roman name. This work was started in 1577, reprinted several times during his lifetime, but not actually translated into English until 1610. So here we are a few examples of the underlying references: Croydon, beautiful spelling, Ribandun. So these are little excerpts from a very long book. We then come to Michael Drayton, splendid, grumpy-looking fellow. He published something called Polly Albion in 1612, then added to it again in 1622. It's one of the longest poems in English, at 15,000 lines. It's a celebration of the English and Welsh countryside, county by county, with a map for most of them. It is dedicated to Prince Henry, the son of James I. This is part of Song 17. So we have another alternative spelling of Wandle, and the Thames without the H, and no other speech be had amongst the streams, but only of this nymph, sweet Wandle, what she wore. Of her complexion, grace, and how herself she bore. This is Alexander Pope, who in 1713 wrote a poem called Windsor Forest. This is it. And he also refers to the river as Vandalis. As ever, he was very pithy and portrayed the Thames as a sort of classical river deity, and surrounded by attendants, if you like, which were the tributaries, which swell the Thames until it reaches its full grandeur. You have to sort of imagine a pastoral image of Queen Anne's reign and the Thames as a symbol of royal power. If you're familiar with Pope, his classic little bit is, "Hear thou, great Anna, whom 3 realms obey, doth sometimes counsel take, and sometimes tay." So you can see where I'm going with this. So right at the bottom, we have the blue, transparent Vandalis, and all the other rivers are parallel. Now we progress to Daniel Defoe. His tour through the whole island of Great Britain was in 3 volumes. And in 1724, he wrote, quote, "From Croydon, it is but a little mile to Cashalton, situate among innumerable springs, which all together form a river in the very street of the town, and joining other springs which come from Croydon and Beddington, make one stream, which are called the Wandle. This village, seated among such delightful springs, makes the most agreeable spot on all this side of London." Oh, so nothing's more there. Defoe may have lived in Mitcham around 1688 because there actually was a Crusoe dairy in the area. I don't know if it was called after him, but it's possible. Now he's progressed to Leigh Hunt. And in his autobiography, he makes a reference to a summer holiday in Merton when he was about 12 or 13. So this would be 1796 to 97. He was staying with an aunt who had rented Spring House on Kingston Road in Merton Park, now demolished and flats, by the way. As a pupil at Bluecoat School, he was required to wear his school uniform, which obviously made him quite conspicuous. And one day he was walking along the Wandle when, quote, "I came upon one of the loveliest girls I ever beheld, standing in the water with bare legs, washing some linen. She showed a blooming oval face with blue eyes on either side of which flowed a profusion of flaxen locks. What she thought of my blue skirts and yellow stockings is not so clear." And he subsequently called her his beauty in the brook. Wow. Now, this is Ravensbury Manor House, a watercolour from the early 18th century. This house fell into ruin in the mid-19th century after the estate was sold, and obviously was in Ravensbury Park in Mitcham. We were donated this by Judith Goodman, to whom again many thanks, and we are not sure who the artist was, unfortunately. It's a very lovely depiction. Now we come to Sir Humphrey Davey, who, as we all know, abominated gravy. He lived from 1778 to 1829, was an inventor and scientist, but also a keen angler. And in 1828, he published what is basically a parody of Isaac Walton's Complete Angler, entitled Salmonia, or Days of Fly Fishing by, quote, an Angler. Like the Complete Angler, which, contrary to some thought, has no reference to the Wandle at all, of a conversation between Physicus, who is the philosopher, and Haleus, who is the fisherman. Physicus says, "I dare say you know where this excellent trout was caught. I never ate a better fish of the kind." Haleus says, "I ought to know, as it was this morning in the waters of the Wandle." And then he goes on to declare the river to be, quote, "the best and cleanest stream near London." And he relates memories of a day fishing with a friend, quote, "in the shady green meadows by the bright clear streams of the Wandle." He also mentions he'd met somebody who'd actually fished the Wandle with Nelson, who of course had to use his left hand. This is part of a 20-page poem called Ravensbury, published in a Merton Historical Society booklet. A massive illustrated work by William Wood Fenning. And this took place in 1850 when he went back to Ravensbury to visit his childhood haunts. So he was here recalling memories of various people, places, and events. And this was published by his great-great-granddaughter, who did all the notations and pulled together this massive work. So this is rather charming. The ruined mill, the western zephyr. But there's an awful lot of it. But if you want a copy, go to the Merton Historical Society and they will happily sell you one. Now this is John Ruskin, who was an only child, quite sensitive to nature and the built environment. And because an adult relative lived in Market Street in Croydon, he may have discovered the river near there. That's clearly not Croydon. In 1866, his lecture, The Crown of Wild Olive, contained this lovely piece here. No lovelier piece of lowland scenery in South England than that immediately bordering on the sources of the Wandle. Clearer or diviner waters giveth rain from heaven. And then in Praetorita, or Things Gone By, his autobiography, he's got another mention of it, with a lovely section, I think, of the cress-set rivulets in which the sand danced and minnows darted among the springs of the Wandle. I think that's lovely. When his mother died in 1871, he financed the clearing of one of the pools behind Honeywood House so that the spring filled, which it hadn't done for a long time. A plaque paid tribute to her, and he hoped it would henceforth be known as Margaret's Well. I'll leave this up a little bit for you. This is the watercolour, dated roughly 1860, of the River Wandle at Wandsworth. This is a card from the collection of the former, and sadly missed, Wandsworth Museum. The artist is John England Nichols. It depicts Williamson's dye works, which were on the east bank of the river, so just north of the present Mapleton Road. And by 1830, these had actually closed. My next picture, I'm afraid, is of rather poor quality. This is because we had to reproduce it behind glass. It was a recent donation, beautifully framed, but rather fragile, and had we taken the glass off, we didn't want to take the chance, so I'm afraid it's a bit blurry. But W.G. Handel Lucas's painting of the Watergate and cottages at Grove Mill, Mitcham, is now quite valuable. In his day, he wasn't a commercially successful artist, but is now fetching good prices. He was born in Croydon right about 1861. He's famous for commissions for Pierce soap and Brook Bond tea, but much little else. From smudgy colour to black and white, this is Smee's My Garden, Its Plan and Culture, dated 1872. And this is one of the many illustrated plates, this is plate 17, a view of Beddington Park before the river was diverted. Smee described it as a babbling trout stream. Now we're coming on to something much more familiar. This is a fabric sample of the Wandle Pattern by, guess who? William Morris, of course, which he described as a gently flowing pattern to honour our helpful stream. It was produced in 1884, and this is shown an indigo release, which is where the pattern is established from the bleaching agent on the block, using various strengths of the bleach so that the resulting design is varied. More commonly, this design is seen in multicolours, showing the river like a twisted stick of candy or barber's pole when it's pink and red, which is very confusing. Now this is Rudyard Kipling, who was born in India, but sent to England when he was 5. His uncle was Edward Burne-Jones, and his college headmaster was a friend of William Morris, so either man could have introduced him to the Wandle. When he was 20, he returned to India and produced a book of verse which included a poem called The Moon of Other Days, published in 1884. Just the briefest of reference to the Wandle, which is, but Wandle's stream is Sigloi now, and the Sigloi is actually a river and a tributary of the Indus. So that's all you get from Kipling. Again, I'm sorry, very fuzzy, but it's the nature of the drawing because it's from a wood engraving. It's by Dewey Bates and it's entitled Near Mitcham. As in fact, so many paintings are near Mitcham, but precisely where we never know, which is an issue in itself. This was in a reprint published by the Merton Historical Society of On the Wandle, one of 3 articles in the English Illustrated Magazine for May 1889. Bates was an American who studied in Europe, and he actually produced this work while staying in friends with Streatham. His artistic work was criticised by academics both in the US and the UK, and so he sold very few pictures. On the Wandle is a rather rambling walk downstream along the river and includes a few inaccuracies, but some of his observations are interesting, especially the declining mill buildings. Now we have Gems of the Wandle. This is number 1. This is a series of Victorian postcards, I have to say, all depicting very similar views. So if you buy the set, you're conned, to be honest. The series was by Morris and Ravensbury, which is the M and R on the bottom right-hand side. And we've even got, on the back, we've got the original postage stamp, because this is a used postcard. And it was posted in 1908, actually quite close to the works of Morris and Ravensbury in southeast London. H.G. Wells, and in War of the Worlds, 1898, chapter 9 is called The Wreckage. Quote, all down the line from there, the aspect of the country was gaunt and unfamiliar. Wimbledon particularly had suffered. Walton, by virtue of its unburned pine woods, seemed the least hurt of any place along the line. The Wandle, the Mole, every little stream was a heaped mass of red weed, in appearance between butcher's meat and pickled cabbage. So there's a jolly thought. Those of you who saw the television adaptation will know what he's talking about. So, pollution of the Wandle from those away from our world. Now, my favourite. This is Christmas on the Wandle, Alice Sloper's Christmas Holiday 1904. This was a Christmas card originally sent out by the Wandsworth Museum. This character was so called because he sloped off down the alleyways to avoid creditors and angry landlords. He originally appeared in Judy magazine in the 1860s. He was created by Charles Ross, who had previously written Penny Dreadfuls. By 1884, he had his own publication, Ali Sloper's Half Holiday. It was one of the oldest forms of comic style to feature a regular character and to have the story described below the illustration and not in a speech bubble. This illustrator was W.F. Thomas, but many others were involved over the years, including C.H. Chapman, who later went on to draw Billy Bunter. With his bulbous nose and often wobbly walk, he clearly enjoyed a drink or two and was a Londoner through and through. His character may have influenced W.C. Field's interpretation of Mr. Micawber, and Charlie Chaplin admitted that Ali had been an inspiration for his Little Tramp. The magazine didn't survive after World War I, as Ali was too typically Victorian and times had changed. There were a couple of attempted revivals, but they failed. I want to get all the gory details and all even the dogs have names. Toodles and Snatcher. I don't think the Wandle is likely to freeze over anytime soon, so make the most of this one. This map is called Springs of the Wandle, done about 1910 by Herbert Moats Ellis. He was a local landowner and surveyor, wrote Bygone Wimbledon and Merton in 1906. The poem around the edge is from Charles Kingsley's Water Babies, and it's called The Tide River. It's a rather unusual presentation, but here we are. Here lived Admiral Nelson, not for long. This is Edward Thomas, who wrote this, In Pursuit of Spring. And in 1913, he made a journey on bicycle from London to Somerset. And In Pursuit of Spring became his final prose work. He described 3 public houses standing on a corner at Somerstown at the edge of the still cultivated and unpopulated portion of the flat land of the Wandle. He describes the allotment gardens, the watercress beds, meadows plentifully adorned with advertisements and thinly sprinkled with horse and cow, 20 acres of damp meadow. On the left, it was bounded by the irregular low buildings of a laundry, a file and tool factory, and a chamois leather mill, and on the right by the dirty backs of Somerstown. We can sense a bit of despair, though, when he says, "It is easy to make this flat land sordid. The kind of estate disappears that might preserve trees and various wasteful and pretty things. If any waste be left under the new order, it will be used for conspicuously depositing rubbish. Little or no wildness of form or arrangement can survive, and with no wildness, a landscape cannot be beautiful." What a cheerful soul. Sounds a bit like Ruskin. Now, getting silly. We have a poem called El Sigloi. This is by one Harry, or Jocelyn Henry Clive, Graham. It's part of the Ruthless Rhymes anthology. Wonderful black humour. This guy had an Eton education, a Sandhurst training, and served in World War I. He was a journalist, a parliamentary private secretary, and a lyricist for plays and musicals. He actually lived in the West End, so we don't really know of a clear Wandle connection. Judith Goodman suggests Gloy is a wonderful name for rhyming, and so it is. He wrote dozens of poems, most with a sort of punch at the end. And this is very cheeky. A maiden in those early days, whom there were very few to praise, and fewer still to fondle. So there we are, fondle and wandle, perfect rhyming. What more can you ask? And the end. I'm left with naught but eggs to poach, a night sans perch, a sans reproach. Very clever, very witty. This is another one that Judith Goodman found for us. Now we have a picture by Maxwell Armfield called The Wandle at Mitcham. This was from a special spring edition of the Studio magazine in 1937, a series called Watercolour Painting of Today. The artist said he was struck by the light and dark mirrored in the moving water, and described the little wooden and tiled houses framed between the 2 trees as pleasant links with the past. So, rather charming. Now, rather fuzzy John Betjeman. And this is from South London Sketch, done in 1944. He rarely ventures south of the Thames, mostly writing about church architecture and, of course, railways. No coffee essence factory is known of at that time, but Kenko did have a presence in later years. Right about there. But this is just lovely. The Wandle lugubriously flowing. Now, this is a classic example of art as a record, something that's no longer there. This is the aqueduct at Wandsworth by a gentleman called Arthur Victor Hein. His descendants kindly donated to the museum a complete file of his works and photographs, sketches. Absolutely brilliant and so kind. So, as I said, it no longer exists. It was built in about 1878 as a high-level sewer above the Wandle Valley between St Anne's Hill and Merton Road. It was about 1,000 yards long. It crossed Garrett Lane and Buckhold Road, but it wasn't well built. Some of the arches started to sag and lean, probably due to the marshy ground. It was buttressed until the 1960s and demolished in 1967 when the sewer was put below ground. This drawing was done in December 1966, but we don't know if the artist suspected that it might soon go. So thank goodness he did it. The same gentleman, his Ode to the Wandle is here. Obviously, it's a very amateur poem, but it's very charming. And there's just a few extracts here. But it's of its time, most definitely the 60s. The stench of the tanning mill and reference to Merton Abbey. Factories now stand, the river runs brown. And the Didecoys camped beside the stream, over the days of strawberries and cream, when the Wandle was a lot cleaner. Another poem, 1970, Carol Rumens. This is the River Wandle, Beddington. Carol Rumens couldn't actually remember writing this poem when we contacted her, but suggested it was roughly in the 1970s, when she was part of a Croydon group of poets, and that the Croydon Advertiser paper used to publish the works of young poets at the time. Carol has subsequently written works for the stage and is now a member of the Society of Authors and gained fellowship of the Royal Society of Literature in 1984. Hugh Fanthorpe also wrote a poem around this time called Rising Damp. Now, full glorious colour. This is the former Liberty Print Works at Merton by a gentleman called Paul Moore. Done, he thinks, around about 1976, because he's been so prolific and kindly has donated copies of many of his local works to our museum. He painted Deeds Mills several times over many years, for example, in the same vibrant colour. Now we go to work by Peter Harris, a sketch of the dye house at Wandsworth. Peter was a local historian and artist, also very prolific. His depictions are very detailed, and we believe he actually worked from photographs. We have a full collection of his work at the Wandle Industrial Museum, kindly donated to us by his widow. Compare this to the work of John Wallace of the New Cut at Wandsworth, totally different style. John was a brilliant researcher and artist who died far too young. And a full collection of copies of his sketches is in the possession of the John Innes Society in Merton Park. Now, the Borrowing Trilogy is by Michael de l'Arabate. This is the cover of book 2. It's a children's book, but it's a little bit unsettling, to put it mildly. The 3 books were published between 1976 and 1986, but the final volume was actually delayed due to the 1985 riots. The Borrowings are street kids. They live on their wits, they avoid authority at all costs, and are fiercely independent. They've long, pointy ears, often covered by woolly hats, and they will live forever unless caught by the police who will clip their ears. At times, these books are quite violent. In book 1, for example, the Rumbles from Rumbledon, I don't think I have to tell you where that really is, had the nerve to infiltrate the Battersea Borrowing's patch, and an army was sent up the Wandle to attack the Rumbledon kingdom. There are descriptions of the slimy green river underground, probably under the Southside shopping centre, and the deciding battles are gruesome. It's quite a unique trilogy. The mantra of the Wandles is, "We are the Wendels of Wandsworth Town. We're always up and the others are down. We're rough and we're tough and we don't give a damn. We are the elite of the Borrowing clan." And here's a section not giving the Wandle a very good show, shall we say. Oozy, muddy, poisonous, decomposed. Knocker is one of the main characters, and at the end of this quote, "If it makes him shiver, then it's scary. The awesome beauty. Strike a light," he said, "what a place." So this is the 70s and early 80s when the Wandle was pretty unattractive. All right, that's enough. Now we have the Burton Tapestry, which many of you would have seen on my lavender talk, so apologies, but it's still art. This was done in the 1980s. It's a painting, but it's in the tapestry style. It's by Moya Hogarth, who was a local artist. Clearly much artistic liberty is being taken with a depiction of the river, but never mind, everything's in the wrong place. The original of this is in the Mayor's Parlour. This Way of the Wandle by John Viner is a delightful poem. John was a former volunteer at our museum. The first stanza, which I haven't quoted here, is, "How does the Wandle its turbulent course pursuit of the Thames from its source?" And then I have quoted 1, 2, 3, 4 following stanzas, and the summary concludes at the bottom, "Thus does the Wandle its turbulent course pursue to the Thames from its source." So it's how it passes through the various sections and various different places. Snuff mills, tobacco mills, water wheels, textiles, craftsmen, apprentices. He's got it all. This is one of the nicest poems I think I know. And bless him, he's got Merton as a priory and not an abbey. This is also at the Wandle Industrial Museum. This is a stained glass panel, which was created in the 1980s when the museum was actually in Wimbledon. It was designed by a member of the museum staff. It's made by the Northwest Lead Company, but not in the traditional style, because it's a single sheet of glass with the lead added later. And on the 4 corners, we've got the coats of arms of Merton, Croydon, Sutton, and Wandsworth. Shows them lavender on the left, lavender fields, and the calico, bleaching, watermill, etc. if you come to the museum expecting to see this quite so vibrantly displayed, I'm afraid the lighting isn't as good as it was at Wimbledon. Sunday Morning at the Centre of the World by Louis de Bernieres is a play produced in 2001. De Bernieres lived in Earlsfield for 10 years and apparently latterly found it a bit parochial. Well, after Captain Corelli's mandolin, his work never really quite found the same success. This play is his interpretation of a South London version of Under Milk Wood, so it won't be exactly flattering. In an interview, he noted that some of the little shops were closing, including the fishing tackle shop. When asked if he'd ever fished the Wandle, he admitted that he hadn't. In the play, one of the characters recalls that there was, quote, foam in the river up to the bridge, all crusted and brown. Pretty, that was. Okay, that's one interpretation. Now we're getting right up to date. The Stronghold of the Eels depicts the eel trap at the wheelhouse at Merton Abbey Mills. The artist Jane Porter has also produced a Wandle Alphabet, which consists of letters formed from items retrieved from one of the many river cleanups. For example, she got the Z from an old typewriter key. And The Ghost Carp, or Moby Dick in Waders, also by Jane Porter, was produced between 2018 and 2019. This is a graphic novel retelling Herman Melville's 1851 masterpiece Moby Dick, set on a 21st century urban river, i.e. the Wandle. It's in 2 parts with 2 more still to come. Part 1 was longlisted for the Myriad Edition's first graphic novel prize of 2018. I have to tell you, it's a little bit gruesome and rather sad. And finally, this is called Change the View. Again, it's the Wandle Industrial Museum. 2019, we had our windows vandalised and boarded up by the council, not replaced. So we thought, well, if we're going to get graffiti, let's do our own artistic interpretation. So this is a design by local artists Portia Dadley and Dominic Fagan. And it's an interpretation of, yes, you've seen it before, the Wandle Pattern by William Morris. It was kindly funded with help from Tesco's Bags of Help scheme. And it was opened late last year, November last year, by Councillor Ed Foley. So that is it, that we have had a quick run through. If the heritage of the River Wandle has interested you, do visit us at the Wandle Industrial Museum in Mitcham. We're next to the Vestry Hall and we overlook the historic cricket green. So thank you very much for listening.